that's scheduled. Understand? So I'll ask now our dear friend, a very well-known scientist, American scientist, very famous, Jeffrey Satinover, a very interesting person, psychologist, psychiatrist, physicist. Perhaps Savir will say a few words, or no? I'll ask him to come here now and give us a little talk.
אם אתם זוכרים אותו לפי הסרט וולד בליב. בבקשה. רק אני אתן לך.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you all very much for the opportunity to address you. It's a real honor to be here. I've had a wonderful time the last couple of days. I'm only sorry that I couldn't stay here longer. What I'm going to talk to you about today is really, it's being presented as advanced science, but from the perspective of what you're studying, it's really extremely primitive. Let me use an analogy. What I'm going to talk to you about today is like somebody finding the shell of a nut and not actually knowing what it is, spending a lot of time studying it and assuming for many, many years that it's a completely dead object and has nothing to do with life at all. But then, finally, after many, many centuries, really centuries of studying it, concluding by examining the intricate tracings of the interior of this shell, that in fact, it must be the shell of a living object, and that there is contained within it something living and nourishing. That's not the shell itself. The analogy that I'm drawing here is that modern science for centuries and centuries has been studying with tremendous success simply the physical world and assuming that that is all there is, and that the physical world is a dead entity and there is nothing else. And only lately has it come to the conclusion that in fact, if you examine the purely physical world very, very carefully, you can find very subtle tracings within it, evidence that it is merely the shell and that there is a vital living substance that is not the shell itself, but something else. Now, I will explain to you furthermore how it is that modern quantum theory in particular is a kind of boundary science. And the subtlest quantum physicists understand this and have said this. However, if you were to spend your time studying modern quantum theory, you'll find that there's a lot of debate about this. So I'm simply going to present what I believe to be the case. I'm going to state this baldly and without contradiction, but you should be aware of the fact that you're simply hearing one man's opinion. And if you happen to have spare time to study quantum theory on your own, then by all means go out and read other people's opinion and come to your own conclusion for yourself. I want to emphasize that quantum mechanics and modern science has nothing to say about Kabbalah and has nothing to say about spirituality. But what it does say, when properly understood, is that the physical world is not the end, that there is something else. but it can't say anything about the nature of that something else. And furthermore, let me speak very precisely here. Modern quantum theory says that everything that we know and the power, the immense power that quantum theory itself gives us over the physical world requires two things. It requires that there be something other than the physical world, and furthermore, that we absolutely cannot know anything about what that something else is through the means of science. This is a subtle point. Oftentimes we want science to become a kind of instrument of spiritual exploration. But the best scientists, the best physicists have understood that that's not possible. Science can, in fact, be used as an instrument, at least intellectually, to lead us up to the point of understanding that there's something more. In the language of Kabbalah, it can, in fact, be an instrument for leading us to recognize the point in the heart, oddly enough. Even the most abstruse mathematics of quantum mechanics can be an instrument for allowing a person to recognize the existence of the point in the heart. But beyond that, it can't go. So now what I want to do today, because it is fascinating and interesting and can be explained relatively simply, in fact, is give you a small introduction to this in a way that you'll understand. I'm not going to use a lot of fancy mathematics, so you don't have to be frightened about that. I will reintroduce language that you've probably heard, if you've heard this language before and it hasn't made sense to you, I congratulate you, because it should not make sense to you. One of the things that prior Kabbalists have said, Kabbalists whom Rav Lightman greatly respects, is that the true nature of reality cannot be visualized. And one of the things that modern quantum mechanics has understood is something quite similar to that. I'm not sure it's the identical statement, but it's a very similar statement, that in fact you cannot use language, you cannot use imagery to properly understand the nature of physical reality. So, for example, many of you, I'm sure, have heard the statement that matter, when properly understood, is simultaneously a wave and a particle. Well, that's a very easy thing to say. It rolls right off the tongue. And perhaps you picture something like this. And in your mind, somehow you put that little equation. But in fact, that's a completely meaningless set of symbols. And there's no way of actually making that make any sense directly. And it doesn't make any sense directly. However, in coming to understand what that actually means, you may begin to see and gain an appreciation of what I said at the beginning, namely that modern science allows us to understand the very limits of modern science, and that there is in fact something beyond the physical world itself. Now, to explain this to you, I'm going to first mention, very briefly, some rather astounding phenomena that are being developed in an area called quantum computation, at the very forefront of which in the world are a number of great Israeli scientists. I'm then going to go quickly to give a rapid presentation of an incisive experiment that was first described in pure thought form by the great American physicist Richard Feynman at Caltech way back in the 1960s. And this description has remained the quintessential description of the mystery of quantum mechanics. And in more recent years, this experiment has actually been performed physically using many, many different kinds of particles. And I'll try to explain to you why this experiment illustrates the limits of science and why it points directly to the existence of something beyond simply the material world. So first, let me point out that for centuries, the central, essential viewpoint of science, and this was the viewpoint held by Einstein, and it's the viewpoint held by the majority of scientists in the world today, is that there is nothing other than the physical world, and furthermore, that every event that occurs in the physical world, including every event in our bodies, and therefore in our brains, and therefore in our minds and in our interactions with one another, and since our brains are all just composed of physical particles, every single event, meaning every interaction of one particle with another, is 100% determined by the motions and the positions and the motions of particles in a previous moment in time. In other words, that the entire physical universe, all of us included, is nothing but a gigantic dead mechanism unfolding inevitably as it must, and that any perception that we think we have of being human beings, of having an awareness, of having emotions, of having intentions, in other words, everything that we're all doing here now, not to mention all the rest of our lives, is simply an illusion. There is no such thing as love, hate, desire, satisfaction. We're nothing but dead particles in very, very complicated assemblages unfolding over time. Now let me first, or second, I guess I've made a number of first points here. Let me second defend that point of view. Just briefly. For instance, essentially every medical advance, many of us here have had severe illnesses and would not be alive were it not for medical advances. Almost every modern medical advance is dependent upon that point of view and has succeeded because of that point of view. So that point of view has a great deal of power and cannot be simply dismissed with a wave of the hand. There is a tremendous amount or proportion of the world which seems to operate according to that principle, however offensive it is, and in fact, however brutal an attack it is on our, not only our sense of ourselves, but on our need for life to have meaning and purpose. Many modern philosophers, many modern lovers of mankind have recognized that the power of that perspective, in spite of how much good it has produced, has also inflicted a terrible wound, precisely because it implies that life is ultimately meaningless. The Nazis, for example, adopted that point of view in many respects wholeheartedly and became very efficient, not only as killers, but also as scientists. And we have indeed incorporated into modern science, including modern medical science, many advances that were first discovered by individuals who were killers. Modern medical philosophy is oftentimes extremely cold-blooded in its approach to human beings, precisely because of the efficiency of that point of view. Now, set that aside for a moment. If you look at computer science is a kind of extreme purification of the logic of this perspective. It's a distillation